information, including the bill of quantities, copies of the contracts awarded, and information on the scope of works during Cricket World Cup 2007, as well as a detailed accounting of the $12 million that was transferred to the Local Organizing Committee, the LOC, in contravention of the Freedom of Information Act. Whereas there has been a national call for transparency and full accountability in government spending associated with the infrastructural and ancillary works at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium leading up to Cricket World Cup CWC 2007. And whereas there have been conflicting reports covering the EC $126 million in government spending at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium from various government ministries and agencies, including a reported $68.5 million paid to C.O. Williams for approximately 6 miles of roads, and $13 million to Hortico Landscaping for the preparation of the outfield and landscaping, among other payments in which there was not corresponding value for money. And whereas this lack of accountability and corresponding lack of value for money in the Cricket World Cup spending is indicative of bad governance and have resulted in the erosion in the integrity of the coordinator of the Intergovernmental Working Group, Ambassador David Shaw, and the loss of public confidence in the UPP government as demonstrated in their failure to institute a commission of inquiry into the CWC spending and to institute a proper ethical governance framework. And whereas the entire citizenry has an obligation to actively promote good governance, any potential inaction of the Parliament, government, and other democratic institutions in actively combating bad governance could be construed as aiding and abetting corruption. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House that this resolution be construed not as a tool of reprisal, but as a social, just, and principled bipartisan cause in the fight for good governance, in protection against the abuse of state resources, and the promotion of transparent and accountable governance in the interests of all Antiguans and Barbudans, especially the poor and vulnerable. That a commission of inquiry be held into the spending associated with the roads, other infrastructural and ancillary works at Sir Vivian Richards Stadium leading up to CWC 2007 in the interests of transparency, accountability and good governance in general.
They took you off of ABS.
That Sir David Shaw be relieved of his position as ambassador pending the outcome of the commission of inquiry. Be it further resolved that the UPP government in the future ensures openness in all of its dealings, including fiscal transparency in the future, open and equitable distribution of government's procurement contracts to avert distortion of competition and wastage, and the full operationalization of the Freedom of Information Act to facilitate public scrutiny and access to information. Now, Madam Speaker.
They took you off of ABS region.
Okay. Madam Speaker, this resolution is not a personal attack on any citizen. Obviously, certain names will have to be utilized in order to elucidate various points. But you'd see that this resolution, in essence, is calling for good governance, for the establishment of a good governance framework within the public sector. And, Madam Speaker, I'm sure you'd agree that in order to effectively manage state resources, a good governance framework is required. In fact, they're not mutually exclusive. They are integrated in order to ensure that you get good value for money, which is one of the requirements of every government, any government. Then obviously there needs to be a good governance framework in place. And you recognize that this resolution is calling for such a framework. It also deals with a very vexing issue, Madam Speaker, and that is the malspending at the cricket stadium. You recall, Madam Speaker, that back in 2005, July, a number of questions were put to the then Minister of Sports the member for Rural North, the Honorable John McGinley, requesting information on the government's readiness for Cricket World Cup 2007. Madam Speaker, this took place almost 2 years before the event actually took place. And at that time, the member for Rural North indicated to the nation that it would have cost the country in the region of $130 million to host Cricket World Cup, which included almost $60 million for the construction of the stadium, which would have been and was a grant from the government and people of China. It meant, therefore, Madam Speaker, that the additional works, all of the other preparations, including road construction, preparation of the outfield, those costs were estimated at just over $70 million. 2 years later, Madam Speaker, additional questions were put to certain members, certain ministers of government, and we got certain information that were indeed conflicting and which were certainly cause for alarm. For instance, Madam Speaker, when the member for St. Philip's South was asked to respond as to the mileage, how many miles of roads are constructed at the stadium and at what cost, he said to this Honorable House that about 6 miles of roads are constructed at a cost of $2.37 million, Madam Speaker. In fact, he went as far as stating that they were state-of-the-art roads. During that session, Madam Speaker, we also asked the Minister of Finance, the member for St. John's Rural East, to give an account of the spending leading up to Cricket World Cup. And we got a schedule of payments, Madam Speaker, which I'm prepared to recirculate just in case it's not in the records of the Parliament. And in this schedule, he indicated that a total of $233,000 were actually spent on the roadworks and the ancillary works to prepare for Cricket World Cup 2007. Madam Speaker, you recognize that the budget, as indicated 2 years prior by the member for St. John's Rural North, was just over $70 million, which would have meant that the actual cost, there was a variance in excess of $50 million. Now, Madam Speaker, we examined the various payments that were made. And just to remind the House, the Honourable House, about these payments, for the construction of roads, curbs and drains, a total of $74,218,000 was spent. I want to reiterate that figure. $74,218,000 was spent on the construction of roads, curbs and drains at the stadium. $68.5 million of which was paid to C.O. Williams. Additional payments, and I'll just outline a few large payments, and this is a report that we got from the Honourable Minister of Finance, the member for Rural East. Additional payments include $12.8 million, or approximately $13 million, that was spent on landscaping, and the amount was actually paid to horticulture, landscaping and nursery. And our understanding, Madam Speaker, at that time, this schedule represented payments that were made. And potentially, there could have been other payments that were made subsequent to this particular report. The report also, or schedule also indicated that $11 million was spent on renting temporary stands, and the amounts were paid to GL Events overlay contractors. Also, there was an amount of $12 million that was transferred to the local organizing committee to cover certain expenses of which they still have not accounted, despite numerous requests from myself to account for this $12 million that was transferred to the LOC. But, Madam Speaker, let us examine the circumstances that has brought us to this stage, whereas we have had to file a motion in this Honourable House to elevate this issue for the attention of the Prime Minister and his government.